The truck groaned up the final incline, its engine a ragged breath in the vast stillness of the Montana high country. Elias kept his hands loose on the wheel, a 10-in-2 grip that had been drilled into him so deep it was bone memory. His knuckles were white anyway. Beside him, in the passenger seat, a German shepherd named Kaiser lifted his head from the worn upholstery. The dog's ears, black triangles against the pale sky, swiveled to catch a sound Elias couldn't hear. A low whine rumbled in Kaiser's chest, a note of inquiry. "Almost there, boy," Elias whispered, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken all day. The words felt foreign in his own mouth, heavy and clumsy. The road crested, revealing a small valley cupped in the hands of jagged, pine-dusted peaks. Down below, a cluster of buildings huddled around a winding creek, the town of Covenant Creek. It looked small and breakable from up here. Elias ignored it. He turned the truck onto a barely there dirt track that branched off from the main road, a path swallowed by aspens and firs. The suspension screamed in protest as the tires dipped into old ruts. Finally, the trees parted, opening onto a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, solid and square, built of logs the color of old honey. It was his. Or it would be. He cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a physical pressure against his eardrums. It was what he had paid for. This heavy, unbroken stillness. Kaiser was already out, his paws making no sound on the packed earth as he began a meticulous circuit of the cabin's perimeter. Nose down, tail low, a silent shadow checking the wire. Elias watched him, a familiar tightness in his chest easing just a fraction. The dog was his early warning system, his anchor. He swung himself out of the cab, his boots landing with a soft thud. The air was sharp, thin, and cold, with the promise of autumn's end. It bit at his exposed skin, a clean, honest pain. He breathed it in deep, letting the cold scour his lungs. He had bought the land sight unseen, 10 acres of nothing with a derelict cabin in the middle. The realtor's voice over the phone had been laced with pity. "No electricity up there, son. No running water. Generator only, and the road washes out come winter." "Good," Elias had said, and wired the money. He walked towards the cabin, his gaze sweeping the clearing, noting the fall of the land, the tree line, the potential fields of fire. Old habits. They didn't die, they just found new terrain. The cabin was rough, but the bones were good. Thick logs, a solid foundation, a metal roof that looked recent enough. But his attention was not on the cabin itself. It was on the space beside it, a wide, flat area of cleared ground bathed in the afternoon sun. This was where the work would begin. Kaiser returned to his side, nudging a cold, wet nose into his hand. The report was clear. All secure. "Let's get to it," Elias said, more to himself than to the dog. The first few weeks were a blur of hard, physical labor. He unloaded the truck, a meticulous inventory of tools, preserved food, and books. There was also a pallet of fire bricks, bags of clay, sand, and lime. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his body screaming with the unaccustomed effort, but his mind grew quiet. The roar that lived behind his eyes softened to a distant hum. He repaired the cabin first, chinking the logs, replacing a few rotten boards on the porch, securing the windows. He was methodical, precise. Each task was a mission, each completed step a small victory against the chaos. Kaiser was his constant shadow, lying nearby with his head on his paws, watching every move with intelligent, amber eyes. The dog never barked, not unless there was a reason. His stillness was as profound as the man's. Then, the real project began. He dug a foundation, a massive stone and concrete slab a few yards from the cabin's eastern wall. It was 10 feet square and 3 feet deep. He mixed the concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow, his shoulders burning, his back a pillar of fire. The work was brutal, but it was clean, it was honest. He didn't have to think, he just had to do. The first visitor was the sheriff. A man named Brody, with a kind face and tired eyes, drove his cruiser up the track one afternoon, kicking up a cloud of dust. Kaiser was on his feet before the engine noise was more than a faint whisper, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Elias put a hand on the dog's neck. Easy. Sheriff Brody got out of his car slowly, hands in plain sight. He nodded at Elias, but his eyes were on the dog. That's a serious-looking animal you got there. He's a good judge of character, Elias said. His voice was flat. Brody looked at the hole, the bags of cement, the piles of sand. Building something? Yes. The silence stretched. The sheriff sighed, a weary sound. Look, son, people in town are curious. A new face, buying the old Miller place. No one's lived up here in 20 years. I like the quiet, Elias replied, not offering more. We're a small community, Brody continued, undeterred. We look out for each other. Just wanted to put a face to the name on the deed. Elias Thorne. Elias just nodded. Brody's gaze drifted to the fresh tattoo peeking out from under Elias's t-shirt sleeve, a unit insignia. His expression softened with a flicker of understanding. Army? A long time ago. Right. Well, if you need anything, you know where to find us. He handed Elias a card. And try to make it into town for supplies now and then. Let folks see you're not building a fortress up here to wage war on us. The sheriff's attempt at a joke fell flat in the heavy air. Elias didn't smile. He just pocketed the card. As the cruiser drove away, Kaiser relaxed, but his gaze remained fixed on the retreating dust cloud. Elias went back to his work, the rhythm of shovel and wheelbarrow a comfort. He didn't want a community. He didn't want to be looked out for. He wanted to be left alone. The foundation cured, and they began to build. He laid the fire bricks with painstaking care, his plans a series of complex drawings in a worn notebook. It was a Russian stove, a pechka, a masonry heater to be precise, but it was unlike any stove the people of Covenant Creek had ever seen. It grew from the foundation like a primitive idol, a hulking beast of brick and clay. It had a firebox, a bake oven, and a complex series of serpentine channels that snaked through its massive thermal mass. It was an engine designed to capture and hold heat, to burn a single, hot fire for a few hours, and then radiate warmth for 24. It was a creature of a colder, harder world. His trips to town were rare and surgical. He would drive in, load up on supplies he couldn't haul himself, pay in cash, and leave. He felt the eyes on him in the general store, heard the whispers stop when he walked down an aisle. That's him, the hermit. What in God's name is he building up there? My cousin flew his Cessna over the property, said it looks like a bunker. The main voice of skepticism belonged to a man named Miller, a burly rancher whose family had been in the valley for generations. Miller held court at the town's only diner, his voice booming with derision. Calls it an oven, Miller scoffed one morning, loud enough for Elias, who was paying for coffee and propane, to hear. An oven the size of a pickup truck. What's he planning on baking in there, a whole damn cow? A few of the other men chuckled. Elias didn't react. He took his receipt, gave a curt nod to the waitress, and walked out. He could feel Miller's glare on his back, a heavy, challenging weight. Back at the cabin, he mixed the clay mortar, his hands caked in the thick, red mud. He worked with a feverish intensity, the whispers from town fueling the fire in his gut. They didn't understand. They couldn't. They lived in a world of thermostats and power grids, of comfort taken for granted. Their world was a thin, fragile sheet of ice over a deep, cold ocean. He had seen that ocean. He had been plunged into it. One night, the cold came early, a sharp, biting frost that silvered the clearing and made the air crackle. Elias sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, with Kaiser's warm body pressed against his leg. The cold was a trigger. It always was. It slipped past his defenses, a silent intruder. The smell of the wood smoke from his small potbelly stove faded, replaced by the scent of diesel and freezing metal. The stillness of the Montana night dissolved into the high, thin whistle of wind across a barren mountain pass. He wasn't on the porch anymore. He was in the back of a striker, the metal walls leaching the warmth from his body. The cold was a living thing, a predator. It gnawed at your bones, slowed your thoughts, stole your will. Outside, the snow wasn't white. It was a flat, dead gray under a sky the color of a bruise. Sergeant Reyes was beside him, his teeth chattering a frantic rhythm. Just gotta keep moving, Thorn. Don't let it get you. But they couldn't move. The convoy was stuck, bogged down in a blizzard that had come out of nowhere, a white wall of fury. The engines had died one by one, their fuel lines frozen solid. They were stranded. The cold seeped in through every seam, every crack in the armor. It was a patient siege. He remembered the silence after the wind died down, a silence more terrifying than the storm. The heavy, profound stillness of extreme cold. The way sound became brittle, sharp. The way your breath hung in the air, a frozen ghost of the life inside you. Reyes had stopped shivering. Elias had noticed it with a dull, slow-thinking dread. "Reyes?" he had whispered, his own lips stiff and numb. No answer. Reyes looked like he was sleeping, a faint, peaceful smile on his blue-tinged lips. It was the cold's final, cruel trick. A wet nose pressed hard against his cheek, a low, urgent whine. Elias gasped, his lungs seizing. The smell of pine and damp earth rushed back in. He was on the porch. The night was dark, filled with the gentle sounds of the forest. Kaiser was standing over him, his front paws on Elias's chest, his amber eyes wide with concern. The dog licked his face, a rough, warm tongue that broke the spell. Elias's heart was hammering against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. His breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in Kaiser's fur. "I'm here, boy," he choked out. "I'm here." The dog stayed with him, a solid, living weight, grounding him to the present, to the solid wood of the porch beneath him. The grounding. It was what Kaiser did. He could sense the shift the moment Elias started to drift, and he would pull him back from the edge. He was more than a dog. He was a lifeline. Elias stayed there for a long time, the cold air on his skin a stark reminder of what was real. He looked over at the half-finished clay monster gleaming faintly in the moonlight. They laughed at his oven. They didn't know he wasn't building it to cook food. He was building it to fight a ghost. He was building a fortress against the cold that lived inside his memory. He finished the stove as the first true snows began to fall, dusting the peaks with white. It stood 15 feet tall, a monolithic presence in the clearing. He had coated it in a final layer of clay and lime plaster, smoothing it with his bare hands until it was a seamless, organic shape. It had a heated bench built into its side, a wide, flat top for drying clothes, and the heavy iron doors of the firebox and bake oven. He built a woodshed next to it and spent 2 weeks cutting and splitting wood, his axe a flashing metronome. He stacked the cords with military precision, enough to last 2 winters, or one very, very bad one. The town's mockery intensified. The Hermit's Pyre, Miller had christened it. The name stuck. Kids would dare each other to ride their bikes up the track to catch a glimpse of the crazy vet and his clay monster. Elias ignored them all. He focused on his preparations. He insulated the cabin's attic, sealed every crack, installed heavy shutters over the windows. He laid in more supplies, medical kits, batteries, fuel for the generator he rarely used. He trusted his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. Something was coming. The signs were subtle at first. He noticed it in the behavior of the animals. The squirrels, usually frantic and chattering, were working with a silent, desperate urgency. The deer that normally grazed in the clearing were gone, moved to lower elevations. The birds fell silent. One morning, the sky was filled with geese, thousands of them flying south in a chaotic, panicked exodus. It was too late in the season for them to be migrating. They were fleeing. He checked the old barometer he had mounted on the wall. The pressure was dropping, not a gradual decline, but a plummet, as if a hole had been punched in the sky. The air grew still, unnaturally so. A heavy, waiting silence settled over the valley. The sky to the north began to change color, a strange, bruised purple-gray on the horizon. Kaiser felt it too. The dog became restless, pacing the cabin, his claws clicking on the wood floor. He would stand at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his hackles raised at an unseen enemy. Elias knew he had to try. He had to warn them. He drove the truck into town, the heavy silence following him all the way. The air felt thin, electric. He found Miller at the diner, as he knew he would be. The rancher was holding court with a half-dozen other men. Elias walked in, and the conversation died. Every eye turned to him. He walked straight to Miller's table. "A storm is coming," Elias said, his voice low and urgent. "A bad one, not like anything you've seen." Miller leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in, the prophet from the mountain." The other men snickered. "I'm serious," Elias pressed. "The pressure is dropping faster than I've ever seen. The animals are gone. You need to prepare." "Prepare for what, Thorne?" Miller scoffed. "A little snow? We get snow here. It's called winter." "This isn't just snow," Elias said, his jaw tight. "This is different. You need to tell people, bring in your livestock, stock up on wood, make sure your generators are fueled." Miller stood up, his bulk towering over Elias. "Let me tell you something, vet," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "We've been living in this valley for 100 years. We know how to handle a storm. We don't need some spooked-out hermit coming down from his clay fortress to tell us how to live." He jabbed a thick finger into Elias's chest. "Go back to your bunker and play with your dog. Leave the real world to the grown-ups." Elias looked from Miller's angry face to the others at the table. He saw no understanding in their eyes, only suspicion and contempt. He had tried. He turned and walked out of the diner without another word. He drove back to the cabin under that strange, darkening sky. He felt a profound sense of failure, but it was overshadowed by a grim certainty. He had done what he could. Now, all he could do was prepare for the fallout. He spent the rest of the day in a flurry of final preparations. He brought Kaiser inside. He filled every available container with water. He secured the storm shutters, plunging the cabin into a dim, preemptive twilight. And then he built the first fire in the pechka. He loaded the firebox with seasoned hardwood, using a top-down burn method he'd perfected. The fire caught with a roar, the draft pulling the flame sideways into the throat of the stove. For 3 hours he fed the fire, keeping it blazing hot and clean. The stove's clay skin grew warm, then hot to the touch. The sound was a deep, powerful hum, the sound of a sleeping dragon. When the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, he sealed the firebox and the chimney damper, trapping all the heat inside the stove's massive thermal battery. Then he waited. The storm hit just after nightfall. It did not arrive with a gradual buildup of wind and snow. It fell upon the valley like a hammer blow. One moment, there was a tense silence. The next, the world outside was a screaming vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a physical force that made the solid log walls of the cabin groan. Elias listened to it, his hand resting on Kaiser's head. The dog was calm now, lying on the rug in the center of the room, his body relaxed. Inside the cabin, it was silent, and it was warm. The heat radiated from the massive clay stove in gentle, steady waves. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a forced air furnace. It was a deep, penetrating warmth, like the sun on your skin. He checked the thermometer, 70 degrees. Outside, the temperature was plummeting. He had an external thermometer wired to an indoor display. It read 10 below, then 20 below, then 30. The power in town would be gone by now. The lines would have snapped in the first few minutes of a wind like this. The people of Covenant Creek would be huddled around their fireplaces, running their generators. But fireplaces were inefficient, losing most of their heat up the chimney, and generators needed fuel. They wouldn't last long. He thought of Miller, so confident, so dismissive. He felt no satisfaction, only a heavy, sinking dread. The vindication was a cold and bitter thing. He sat in his armchair, the only light coming from a single oil lamp that cast flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth from the stove wrapped around him like a blanket. Kaiser slept at his feet. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt safe. But he was alone in his safety, and that felt like its own kind of failure. The storm raged for 2 days. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of his cabin and the ceaseless, howling fury outside. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying the windows, sealing him in a tomb of white, but inside, the warmth held. Once every 24 hours, he would open the stove, build another hot, fast fire for a few hours, and then seal it again. The temperature inside the cabin never dropped below 68 degrees. The external thermometer bottomed out at 52 below zero. The wind chill was off the charts, unsurvivable. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was as shocking as the storm itself. It was a deep, profound stillness, the silence of a world frozen solid. Elias opened the door a crack. The snow was piled higher than the doorway. He had to shovel his way out. When he finally emerged, he stepped into a world transformed. Everything was buried under a thick, sculpted blanket of white. The sun was blindingly bright on the snow, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. But there was no warmth in the sunlight. The air was so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. It stole the breath from his lungs and burned his skin. He could hear nothing. No birds, no wind, nothing. The great white silence. He knew, with the certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that people were dying down in that valley. He went back inside and began to prepare. He pulled on layers of thermal clothing, the same gear he had worn in the mountains of Afghanistan: wool, fleece, and a windproof outer shell. He strapped on snowshoes. He packed a bag with a medical kit, high-energy food, water in an insulated container, flares, and a small, powerful hand-crank radio. Kaiser watched him, his body tense, knowing. "Stay here, boy," Elias said. "Guard the house." The dog whined, a sharp note of protest. Elias knelt and put his forehead against the dog's. "I need you here. This is the fallback point. Secure it." The military command seemed to settle the dog. Kaiser sat, his gaze fixed on Elias, a silent soldier on duty. Stepping out into that cold was like stepping onto another planet. The snow was light and powdery, difficult to get a purchase on even with snowshoes. He made his way towards the road, a journey that was usually a 5-minute walk. It took him almost an hour. The valley was unrecognizable. Houses were just white mounds, their roofs heavy with snow. Cars were buried completely. There was no smoke coming from any of the chimneys. A bad sign, a very bad sign. He switched on the hand-crank radio, cycling through the emergency frequencies. Static. Then a voice, faint and laced with panic. "Anyone hear me? This is Covenant Creek. We need help. The power is out. No heat. People are... It's so cold." The voice cut out. It was enough. He knew where he had to go first. Miller's ranch was on the edge of town, the most exposed. He trudged through the deep snow, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The effort was immense, his body already feeling the strain of the cold. He found the ranch house half buried in a massive drift. The windows were thick with frost on the inside. He pounded on the door. "Miller, it's Thorne. Are you in there?" Silence. He put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It was frozen shut. He kicked it, the sharp impact jarring his leg to the hip. The wood splintered. He kicked again, and the door burst open. The cold that rushed out from inside the house was somehow colder than the air outside. It was a dead, still cold. The cold of a tomb. "Miller!" he yelled into the darkness. A faint sound answered him, a child's whimper. He followed the sound, his boots crunching on the frozen floorboards. He found them in the living room, huddled together under a pile of blankets. Miller, his wife, and their 2 small children. They were barely moving, their faces pale, their lips blue. Miller looked up at him, his eyes wide and vacant with the first stages of severe hypothermia. "Thorne?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "You were right." "Talk later," Elias said, his voice sharp, authoritative. "We need to move, now." He went to work, his training taking over. He checked them for frostbite, his movements quick and efficient. He got the children up first, forcing them to move, rubbing their limbs to get the circulation going. He wrapped them in the emergency thermal blankets from his pack. Miller's wife was barely conscious. Miller himself tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. Can't feel my feet," he mumbled. "You're coming with me," Elias said. "All of you. My cabin is warm." The word warm seemed to rouse them, a flicker of hope in their dull eyes. Getting them back to his cabin was one of the hardest things Elias had ever done. He half carried, half dragged Miller, while the rancher's wife leaned on him from the other side. The two children, a boy and a girl, stumbled behind them, their small hands clutching his pack. Every step was a battle against the snow, the cold, and their failing bodies. The sun began to set, painting the frozen landscape in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped even further. Elias focused on a single point, the smoke rising from his own chimney. It was a thin, gray wisp in the vast, cold emptiness, a beacon. When they finally stumbled into the clearing, Kaiser was at the door, barking, a sound of urgent alarm and relief. The wave of warmth that hit them as Elias pushed open the door was a physical shock. It was like stepping back into the living world. Miller's wife started to cry, silent tears freezing on her cheeks. The children just stared at the massive clay stove, their eyes wide with wonder. Elias settled them on the floor near the stove, wrapping them in every blanket he owned. He heated water, making them drink warm, sweet tea. He checked their hands and feet, treating the frostbite with a gentle, practiced touch. Miller watched him, his face a mask of shame and disbelief. "Why?" Miller finally managed to ask, his voice cracking. "After what I said, why would you help me?" Elias looked up from wrapping the little girl's hands. "Because no one deserves to freeze to death," he said simply. He left them to recover and went back outside. The rescue had just begun. He knew the sheriff's office would be the next logical place. Brody would have tried to set up a shelter there. It was a brick building, more defensible against the cold than the wood frame houses. He took Kaiser with him this time. The dog's ability to navigate in the low light and his keen senses would be invaluable. They moved through the frozen streets of the town like ghosts. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their steps on the snow and the eerie groan of trees contracting in the extreme cold. He found the sheriff's office just as he expected. The generator had died. Inside, he found Sheriff Brody and a dozen other townspeople, including the old woman who ran the general store and the young waitress from the diner. They were huddled together, their faces grim, their hope fading. Brody looked up as Elias entered, his face haggard. "Thorne, I should have listened to you." "No time for that," Elias said. "How many are here?" 13. A few others are holed up in the church, but I haven't heard from them since the radio died. "My cabin is warm," Elias said, the words becoming a refrain. "It's big enough. We move in small groups, the weakest first." It took 4 trips, 4 long, grueling journeys through the deepening twilight and the soul-crushing cold. Elias and Kaiser led each group, breaking a trail through the snow, encouraging them, pushing them when they faltered. His cabin became a refugee camp. People were crowded together on the floor, on the benches, anywhere they could find a space. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke, but it was warm. It was alive. The massive clay stove was the silent, beating heart of their survival. Miller's wife and the other women organized the supplies, making soup, tending to the children and the elderly. Miller, his frostbite treated, helped Elias, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet, desperate need to be useful. The last group to bring in was from the church. The old wooden building was failing, its structure groaning under the weight of the snow. As Elias was helping the town's elderly pastor, Mr. Henderson, down the icy steps, a loud crack echoed through the frozen air. The roof of the church porch, overloaded with a massive drift, gave way. It collapsed in a shower of snow, ice, and splintered timber. Elias shoved the pastor forward, out of the way, but he wasn't fast enough to get clear himself. He saw the heavy main beam falling towards him. He braced for the impact. It never came. A black and tan blur shot past him. Kaiser, with a powerful, snarling leap, slammed into his side, knocking him clear of the falling beam. The timber crashed down where Elias had been standing a second before. But it caught Kaiser, a glancing blow that sent the dog tumbling with a sharp cry of pain. Elias's blood ran cold. "Kaiser!" He scrambled through the snow and debris to the dog's side. Kaiser was whimpering, trying to get up, but his back leg was bent at an unnatural angle. A shard of wood was embedded deep in his flank. The world narrowed for Elias, the dozen other survivors forgotten. There was only his dog, hurt, bleeding in the snow. He gently probed the injury, his touch surprisingly delicate for such large, calloused hands. The leg was broken, badly. He looked at the people huddled nearby, their faces etched with fear and concern. He looked back at his dog, the mission, his friend. There was no choice. There was never a choice. "Get to the cabin," he ordered Miller, his voice raw. "Follow my tracks. Don't stop." Without waiting for a reply, he carefully scooped the 90-pound dog into his arms. Kaiser cried out in pain, but then went still, trusting him completely. Elias turned his back on the town and started the long walk home, carrying his wounded partner. The weight was immense, his muscles screaming in the cold, but he didn't notice. He whispered to the dog, his breath frosting in the air. "Hang on, boy, just hang on. I've got you." He left his pack behind, his rifle, everything but the dog. He was the only thing that mattered. He stumbled into the cabin, exhausted, his body at its absolute limit. The faces of the townspeople turned to him, their expressions of relief turning to shock as they saw the injured dog in his arms. He gently laid Kaiser on a pile of blankets next to the warm clay of the stove. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady despite his exhaustion. He cleaned the wound, removed the splinter of wood, and stitched the gash closed with a needle and thread from his medical kit. He splinted the broken leg, his movements precise and economical. The whole room was silent, watching him. They were seeing a different man, not the crazy hermit, not the stoic veteran. They were seeing a man desperately trying to save his only family. When he was done, he sat on the floor beside Kaiser, his hand resting on the dog's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. He didn't move for hours. The storm finally broke on the 5th day. The sky cleared and the temperature began a slow, grudging climb. The cabin had held, the stove had held. Everyone was alive. They gathered in the clearing, blinking in the bright sunlight, looking at the transformed world. The silence was broken by the distant chop of a helicopter. Help was finally coming. As they waited, the community of Covenant Creek stood in a loose circle around Elias. Sheriff Brody stepped forward. "I don't know how to say this, Thorne," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But you saved us. All of us." Then Miller pushed his way to the front. His face was raw with emotion, his eyes red. He stood before Elias, a big man made small by humility. "I was a fool," Miller said, his voice choking. "A proud, stupid fool. I laughed at you. I called you crazy." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "You were building an ark, and when the flood came, you opened the door to the very people who mocked you. I owe you my life, my wife's life, my children's lives." He stuck out his hand. "I am sorry, and thank you." Elias looked at the outstretched hand, then at Miller's face. He saw no pity there, no condescension, only a profound, genuine gratitude. Slowly, he reached out and shook Miller's hand. A murmur went through the small crowd. It was a moment of acceptance, of a bridge being built over a chasm of misunderstanding. Miller's young daughter, the one whose hands Elias had wrapped, came forward shyly. She held out a piece of dried meat. "This is for the brave dog," she whispered. She walked over to where Kaiser lay on the porch, his splinted legs stretched out, and gently placed the offering by his nose. Kaiser lifted his head and gave her hand a weak lick. The little girl giggled, a sound of pure, simple joy in the quiet clearing. It was Brody who finally asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Why, Thorn?" he asked gently. "Why did you know? What made you build all this?" He gestured to the massive clay stove, which was still radiating a gentle warmth into the cold air. Elias looked at the stove, at his fortress against the cold, and for the first time he spoke, not in clipped, terse sentences, but with a quiet, steady voice that held the weight of memory. He told them about Afghanistan. He told them about the mountain pass, the surprise blizzard, the stalled convoy. He told them about the cold, the insidious, patient cold that had crept into their armored vehicles and stolen the life from his friends. He told them about Sergeant Reyes, who had fallen asleep and never woken up. "The enemy we were trained to fight, we could see," Elias said, his gaze distant. "But the cold, you can't shoot the cold. You can't fight it. It just waits. It takes everything, and it doesn't make a sound." He looked around at their faces, at the dawning comprehension in their eyes. "I came here for the quiet, but I could still hear the silence of that mountain. I knew what a cold like that could do. I never wanted anyone to feel that kind of cold again, that kind of helplessness." He looked down at Kaiser, who was watching him, his amber eyes filled with an almost human understanding. "So I built something that the cold couldn't beat, something solid, something real." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or heavy. It was full of respect, of sorrow, and of a shared understanding. They weren't looking at a hermit anymore. They were looking at a survivor, a protector, a hero. In the weeks that followed, Covenant Creek began to thaw, both literally and figuratively. The National Guard arrived, bringing supplies and helping to clear the roads. But the real work of rebuilding was done by the community itself, and at the center of it was Elias. They didn't just ask for his help, they asked for his knowledge. Miller was the first. "Will you teach me?" he asked one day, standing in Elias's clearing. "How to build one of these. I never want my family to be cold like that again." Soon others came. Sheriff Brody, the waitress from the diner, the young ranch hands who used to snicker at him. They came not with suspicion, but with notebooks and a humble desire to learn. Elias, the man who had come to the mountains seeking only solitude, found himself a teacher. He showed them how to read the weather, how to understand the signs in the sky and the behavior of the animals. He taught them how to insulate their homes properly, how to prepare for the worst, not as paranoid survivalists, but as prudent, responsible people. And he taught them how to build the stoves. The clearing by his cabin became an outdoor classroom. He showed them how to mix the clay, how to lay the fire bricks, how to design the complex flue channels that captured every last bit of heat. They worked together, their hands covered in the same red clay that had built his own stove. There was laughter in the clearing now, the sounds of people working together, of a community healing itself, of a community becoming stronger. Elias found himself speaking more, the words coming easier. He even found himself smiling, a small, rusty motion that felt both strange and wonderful. He was no longer just fighting his own ghosts. He was helping others build a defense against their own. He was turning the source of his greatest trauma into a source of strength and safety for his new community. The hole inside him, the one carved out by the cold and the loss, was beginning to fill. It was being filled with purpose. One evening, as the last of the summer light faded from the sky, Elias sat on his porch. Kaiser lay beside him, his head on Elias's lap. The dog's leg had healed, leaving him with a slight limp, a warrior's scar. He was a hero in the town, doted on by the children, respected by the adults. Across the valley, Elias could see the smoke rising from half a dozen new chimneys. But it wasn't the thin, wasteful smoke of inefficient fireplaces. It was the clean, hot smoke of the first firings of new masonry heaters, new hearts of warmth being born in the valley. They were ready now. Whatever came, they would be ready. Together. Elias stroked Kaiser's head, feeling the familiar, grounding warmth of his companion. The shadows in the valley lengthened, but they held no menace. The silence that settled over the mountains was not the heavy, waiting silence of his memory. It was a peaceful stillness, a quiet promise of the night to come. For the first time in a decade, Elias felt the stillness not as an absence, but as a promise of peace, knowing that his and Kaiser's next journey was already waiting for them.